Well, welcome to Intersections. It must be Thursday. It must be 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. And here we are. Or I should say, here I am, since my co-host Brian Solis is on an airplane, uh, heading actually for a serious purpose to try to figure out what's going on with the fires nearing South Tahoe, where he has a house. So this is a great example of how wicked problems at a global level, which we read about in the papers, actually touch us individually and in very significant ways. But welcome to Intersections, our weekly jam session where we mash up culture, innovation, technology, design to contribute to greater perspective, greater understanding, and to unlearning, to freshening up perspective. Brian Solis, my co-host, has a day job as global evangelist for innovation at Salesforce, but has a long tail reputation linking digital matters before digital was really visible on the horizon as a subject matter unto itself, linking digital to innovation, to social media, to marketing, and many other fields. And we are highly complementary. I was an innovation activist really before I knew what the word innovation meant. I think having been a serial entrepreneur since grade school, but also pursuing innovation from an intellectual and academic perspective, 14 years at Harvard Business School, teaching business creativity and innovation, working with a lot of different kinds of companies, starting companies, advising companies, and accumulating an eclectic body of professional experience that I bring to the table for hopefully the delectation of all of you. So here we are. Please feel free to make comments in the chat. We'll try to do our best to identify the geographies, which always amaze me. We have, I think, an unusually international cohort of viewers, followers, fans, friends, however we choose to describe you, and hopefully are adding to that. You should know that the all of the interviews are on intersectionslive.com, which is a web presence that we are constantly in the process of upgrading. But you can now identify specific interviews. There will be written descriptions in more detail forthcoming for each of the interviews. And, the people we talk with are not fashion trends. They're seriously building the edifice of a new understanding of where we're heading in terms of this new economy. So that's a long-winded way of saying that the interviews are evergreen, that they're, I think, continuously relevant. There isn't a single one, I think, that's gone out of date. So it's useful, I think, for you to take a look at those. We welcome your comments. We welcome your suggestions, ways of making the show better. And without further ado, it's our guests who make the show what it is. And I'd like to introduce our first guest who's on deck, Dr. Jonathan Reichental, who has a very eclectic background, software program manager and chief innovation officer formerly at the fabled and storied O'Reilly Media. But also chief innovation officer or chief information officer of the city of Palo Alto, which we know is in the kind of the epicenter of Silicon Valley, the Silicon Valley conspiracy. And he's the founder and CEO of a company called Human Futures, which is, by my reading, sort of the ultimate hyphenated company. It does advisory work, investment advisory, IP development, thought leadership, and more besides. So, Jonathan, it's a pleasure to meet you virtually.
I'm very thrilled to be here, John. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to see you. I'm missing my buddy Brian, but I'm looking forward to the chat with you.
Right. I think, he had a legitimate emergency, so we occasionally cover for one another.
That's right.
Well, I think, first of all, it might be useful to just understand your home base in terms of what Human Futures is all about. I don't think I did it nearly justice, and I'm curious about what went into the decision to start it and how all of these different, kind of functionalities fit together. Because, there's a lot of rhetoric around the future is eclectic and range is important and doing things, not in a kind of a singular way, but T-shaped skills, X-shaped skills, etc. So what's the story around human futures?
Yeah. Well, I was getting ready to leave the city, my city work, about 3 years ago. The city manager was retiring after 35 years, and I was ready to move on to my next adventure. Of course, it's Silicon Valley, so one of the options is always to create your own startup. I did look at some more traditional paths, and but I said, this is the chance. This is my opportunity to start something myself and do more of what I love doing. So in a way, I like that you described Human Future sort of rather eclectic, because it is. It's a collection of stuff I love to do. At the core of who I am is an educator. So a big piece of what we do is helping individuals and organizations understand the impact, particularly of technology, on themselves, their organization, and on society. We don't go that far out, but we talk about things that are happening today, things that are happening in the next a few years. There's an advisory part to that. So, some people want to get inspired and they want to understand the future, but they also want to act on it. They want to actually execute. So I help with that too. I help all sorts of organizations in both the private sector and the public sector. And the final piece is, I've actually really enjoyed helping startups, particularly social impact businesses, get their organizations underway. My work in public service over the last 10 years, and particularly in cities, has sort of positioned me to be able to help a lot of these startups get into governments and understand, how do you get doors opened, and how do you present information that is consumable for city decision makers. So in terms of themes, real quick, I'm a generalist when it comes to tech. I mean, I love everything from data governance to blockchain, crypto, quantum computing, through to the future of cities, and more. But I generally find day to day that I'm working with a lot of cities. That really has become not only a love that I have, but an area where I think I'm able to add a lot of value.
Well, that's a great transition. You've written a couple of books with equally intriguing titles. The first one, I guess we should talk about a little bit, is Smart Cities for Dummies. And I guess, the notion of smart cities is out there. People talk about it a fair amount, but it would be useful to get your point of view about, what is it about cities that should concern us in terms of making them smart? In what ways are we dumb about where cities are going? What are the big challenges and opportunities that you see in terms of moving us from here to a world that is essentially going to be largely cities? How does that draw from your experience working at the city of Palo Alto, which is not a megalopolis, but clearly a city? They call themselves a city, so they must be a city.
That's right. Well, when I joined the city of Palo Alto back in 2011, I saw it as a lot of technologists as a big problem space to participate in, to help figure out some kind of pretty intractable issues around running a city in the 21st century. But the real story is that I fell in love with cities, and I got to talk to and work with cities all over the world. And it's a lot of what I do right now. It's a great question, and it's an important one to answer, is like, why? What's going on? The first thing you need to know is we're largely an urban planet today. More people live in cities than in rural areas, and that's accelerating. We're adding about 3 million people to cities every week. We're building
in the worldwide,
in the world.
3 million. Yeah. Okay.
3 million people migrate into cities, and we're building the equivalent of infrastructure about the size of New York City, like Manhattan, every month, and we'll do that for the next 30 to 40 years. 40% of the cities that exist today were, I should say, half the cities that exist today were built in the last 40 years. So, the human trajectory is towards rapid urbanization, and despite our little unfortunate pandemic here, cities are not going away. In fact, they're getting more important. We have the phenomenon of megacities. A few years ago, we just had a small handful of cities that were over 10 million people, and now we have over 35 cities over 10 million people. Cities and the urban experience have become the central human experience and will be for the next century and beyond. If we're going to fix things like, or even stabilize things like the climate emergency, we're going to do it in cities. If we're going to increase opportunities for more people in terms of economic inclusion, and opportunity overall in education and healthcare, it's going to happen in an urban context. Now, the flip side of that is many of our cities in the world are certainly not ready for that. Have been caught by surprise, have sort of neglected infrastructure. And we have a lot of intractable issues, from having enough abundant clean energy to managing the climate emergency, which is created by cities and will be solved in cities for the most part. Issues around public safety, and then we see behaviors changing, and the expectations of communities changing. People expect digital services from the governments, from their cities. We anticipate self-driving cars coming quite rapidly, and drones, and all the changes that come with that. So it's a phenomenal space. It's worth around $2.5 trillion in economic opportunity by 2025, and it will create about $10 trillion of global economic growth by 2030. So it's also an incredible opportunity for entrepreneurs and for industry. You asked me, I think, at the end of your question about how did Palo Alto maybe prepare me for it. I think what that did was it gave me an entry point into this incredible space, and that was a surprise because I was I was planning to solve problems and make the commitment as I did to a city. I ended up falling in love with cities and really making a life out of it. So that's a little bit about the background and why cities are important.
So I'm just curious to follow up on Palo Alto a bit, because I'm wondering the extent to which Palo Alto had a unique character in terms of supporting innovation, since it's right in the middle of Silicon Valley, and Stanford's there, and Sand Hill Road is adjacent, and so forth and so on. But where Palo Alto also had classically some economic divide problems in terms of, if you go east of the freeway, then the economic vitality kind of drops off pretty dramatically. So to what extent did your experience include getting a little more sensitivity to how a city supports innovation, and how it also, in a somewhat privileged situation of resource abundance, deals with some of these social equity issues?
Yeah. And much of that kind of context, particularly the being surrounded by an incredible, rich tech community, was attractive to me. If I was going to try to create new models for delivering city experiences, it seemed like a good place to do it. At the same time, it is a city that's a complete outlier. It does not represent the cities of the world. It is a unique little town that is highly, as you say, privileged and affluent and successful in many ways. But it's also an older community, and in an older community that's established and comfortable, there isn't necessarily a massive appetite for change. But there are things like better city services. We still see today far too many processes that are analog. You have to go to a place, fill out a form, maybe come back, and it's very inefficient.
Stand in line, right?
Right, stand in line. We have this, well-earned reputation, cities do, for bureaucratic and inefficient services. And to me, I look at that, and that just seems like incredible opportunity. In fact, it translates to trillions of dollars opportunity over the next few years. So we did things like, I did have this great platform to do a lot of digitalization. We were able to bring many services that were analog on sort of the day one of when I arrived. By the time I left, we had all the core services were online, either through a website or through an app. So that's one of the ways that the tech community did help in bringing forward ideas to me, and
Mhm.
the partnerships we had. We were able to be sort of a first mover and test a lot of things. But smart cities are not only about digitalization, which is a huge part of it, but it's also about the built environment. It's about
Mhm.
what can we do to improve traffic? How can we clean the air, get better water, stuff like that? Some of these issues weren't dominant, in the community I was managing, but I had the opportunity then to work with and advise cities, from Paris to Dubai and Melbourne and Australia,
Mhm.
around these issues, which they really do struggle with, huge inequalities, big problems with air quality and water
Right.
and energy. Um, so that's the background there.
Yeah. So let's get into the smart cities notion a little bit more. So how close are we to what you might call an operating system for a smart city?
Mhm.
Where all of the different relevant functionalities are integrated
Mhm.
into whether you call it a platform strategy or an
Mhm.
OS or and related to that. Where do you see connectivity going between cities? Because it seems to me that, if you've got 35 megacities already, the idea that every one of them is going to have an innovation committee that's going to figure out autonomous vehicles and, kind of digitization of services and stuff I mean, you want to respect the locality of
Right.
things. But by the same token, you don't, it's like you don't want to reinvent CRM 35 times or, some basic, operating system for your computer 35 times because you happen to be in 35 different cities. So, and to what extent are cities kind of reaching out to one another to share best practices? Because it seems like, while Paris is different from Melbourne, there are certain archetypal functionalities that, benefit from the kind of efficiency that comes from, if not standardization, at least convergence around best practices, right? And then the other thing is, if cities are the vehicle for modernity in terms of culture and in terms of, new stuff and climate related, sustainability related practices, it would seem like the connectivity between cities. So it's like the mega city concept of, how do urban environments begin to connect to co-evolve becomes important. So this obviously relates back to your digital expertise. How far down the road
Mhm.
are we on all of
Yeah.
these things?
Yeah, a lot of good stuff there. I'll try to hit on everything you said. The first question you were asking about, how close are we to some sort of, integrating operating system for a smart city? Is there a platform for cities? Not at all, and probably unlikely we'll ever get there. That's a little bit of a sort of a direction that some tech companies kind of pursued, thinking that cities were maybe like corporations, and they couldn't be more different in how they operate, and they're shaped and designed. Um, and it also talks to a little bit of how people think that smart cities are about technology, right? And technology in the sense of sensors and connectivity and apps and things. One of the things I like to throw out to sort of help people understand how broad this space is, one of the greatest phenomena of our current time around smart cities is the adoption of bicycles, right?
Mhm.
There have been some big cities in the world that have really gone big on bicycles, but for the most part, bicycles in the center of an urban area haven't been that prolific, outside of China and the Netherlands and some other areas. But let's go to France for a moment. I remember going over there a few years ago and meeting with the deputy mayor, and he was talking about how they were experimenting with making available those rentable bicycles on the street.
Mhm.
And when they started talking about it, everybody at the city leadership said, "This won't work. Parisians do not cycle. Riding a bike is just something we don't do." And they said, "Well, let's experiment." So they rolled out, I'm going to make the number up, like 200 bikes, and immediately they were all used. There was not enough. And then about a month later, 400, and then after 2-3 months, at 1,000. Today, if you see a picture of Paris, everyone's cycling. It's been a remarkable transition. And in communities all over the world, including our own here in Silicon Valley, You're seeing greater focus on allowing people to have bike lanes and safer places to cycle, as well as the introduction of things like e-bikes. So the space itself is quite broad. The way that cities function, you think about a library system as part of a city, but also a fire service as part of a city. And you couldn't think of two things maybe that are completely different. Why would there ever be sort of a connective tissue necessarily between these things? The way that they serve people are different. The services are different. The measurements are different. So this idea of sort of an underlying operating system, I think, was a nice sort of tech marketing pursuit for a few years. But that's not where we're at today. It's much more about big ideas, smart ideas, about bold leadership. It's about bringing the community along on a journey around behavioral changes, using less energy or being more efficient about energy. Now, the second part of your question was about, are cities talking to each other? Are they sharing best practices? Are they even sharing some infrastructure? I think you hit the nail on the head when you said cities generally are looking out for themselves. And it is kind of extraordinary. Even here in Silicon Valley, we have about 40 cities basically in the regional area in our geography. 40 cities of anywhere from 25,000 to up to 100,000. Then we have a couple of outliers, but that's sort of the general population. And we do have one of everything. Every city has its own fire service. Every city has its own CRM. Every city has its own 911, with a few exceptions. So generally, cities in the United States and abroad are very bad at this. The inefficiency in not sharing systems is a glaring problem that isn't going to be solved anytime soon. Where we do see regional efforts is around transportation, for example. You have to do that when it comes to things like rail systems and even the highway systems and things like that. We see regional efforts around climate efforts. There's some really great stuff being done in not only the Bay Area, but California and then the US. Then you see same thing happening in Europe. Around public safety, we see some good regional efforts. So there are places where cities are smart enough to cooperate. They see the benefit. I'll give you one quick example of work that I was involved in. The city of Palo Alto had to upgrade the 911 system, right? Pretty core to any city. We decided to sort of do an outreach to a few cities in our area and say, hey, would you like to go in with us on buying a 911 system? And two cities did. Los Altos and Mountain View said, yeah, we're in. And so we jointly purchased it and we built redundancy. So there was failover in our 911 system. But it even meant things like putting in place policies for, and I'll just say this sort of tongue in cheek, if you're chasing a gangster, in Palo Alto, and that gangster happens to run into Mountain View, it's not like you say, well, it's Mountain View's problem now. We put in place the policies that you could continue to chase after the gangster. Obviously, I'm being a bit funny there. But the point being, it not only does this collaboration involve tech, but also forces us to be better in our soft process of collaboration as well.
So speaking of collaboration, one thing that actually links us to our next guest is the notion of cities as innovation hubs, because you're probably aware that there's pending legislation at a pretty lavish scale, I would say, to fund a national directorate of science and innovation based on the National Science Foundation template that will also include funding for 10 innovation hubs centered on 10 cities that represent, high potential regionalization opportunities.
Yeah.
And I presume there'll be cities that have universities and some indigenous industrial base and like a vision, hopefully. What do you think of that idea of innovation hubs as a way to kind of contribute to our national innovation prowess? And have you seen good examples of that in other parts of the world?
Well, broadly, I'm very supportive and I like it. I hope it doesn't come at the exclusion of areas, right? So, if money pours into a certain area, does that mean other areas of the country aren't going to see the benefits? I hope there's a way that we can certainly see broader impacts, and particularly to communities that are in need, right? I don't know that, for example, Silicon Valley needs more innovation hubs, right?
Right.
I think we're replete with it. Plus, we have plenty of capital here. But there are high potential areas in the U.S. that, particularly, in the more central parts of the country, that have the interest, the talent, the educational institutions to really prosper. I'm very, very supportive of the idea of innovation districts, and we see good examples of those having strong economic benefits to communities. There's one example I'll give you. My friend up at the CIO, Michael Peggs, up in Aurora, Illinois, and he became the CIO there just a few years ago, having come out of the private sector. And he's very close to the mayor and the city leadership, and they wanted to be a bit progressive. They wanted to do something different. They were an industrial town. Their main employer left and kind of left them bare. And they said, well, what do we do? How do we create a good future for this great town? And so they said, we're going to have an innovation district. But what really makes it fascinating is usually an innovation district is in a part of the city that is in disrepair. Maybe it's an old industrial area, and cheap real estate, and there's incentives for, they give tax incentives and things like that, and grants and stuff. Well, they made the whole city an innovation district, and I thought that was genius. And they were able to find some partners, and so the entire city is being revitalized as a consequence. There's a lot of physical infrastructure going up, like digital signage and projects around drones and stuff, that is not just benefiting one area that one would hope in time would permeate everywhere, but they're seeing the benefits around the communities. So they generally are really very, very successful. Enschede in the Netherlands, for example, they have an innovation area, and they have taken a domain. So they want to be leaders in Europe around drones. And so their innovation hub within the innovation district is to attract and really take not only investment from the outside around drones, but also have the university programs be aligned with it to push that. So they become experts. They become, an economic center for drone research and development. So I like it a lot. I mean, the devil, as you know, in your incredible career, is in the implementation, how you actually execute on it. But the idea is very, very important.
So, as you look around the world, which are the, I should say, maybe 2 or 3, 4 exemplars of best practices, most forward reaching execution in the smart cities area? I mean, what are the cities that you admire, and why do you admire them in particular?
What I've discovered in the last couple of years, and particularly pre-COVID, because I've been sort of not traveling near as much since COVID, is smart city efforts reflect the needs of each community. So you're going to find a big, differences in how you cities are executing on their plans and what their needs are. Again, what's important to New York is probably going to be different from Cairo or, Helsinki. I do see often, though, some themes, and you do see themes around transportation, energy, digitalization, and sustainability. These are sort of 4 very common threads, and those threads are kind of increasing as cities grow and they experience similar issues. But you have to recognize that cities have different cultures. They have different economic situations. They have different geography. Some are hilly, some are desert based. So there's a whole variety of things that go into what they're doing. And so what I would say is, as I look out, I think, for example, some countries or some cities do well in one particular area. So we're often driven towards the Scandinavian countries when it comes to projects around sustainability, reducing carbon emissions, more public transport and light rail. greater bicycle use, more digital services, and a lot of additional sort of social programs that help with giving people a better quality of life. So, Helsinki, it definitely always comes up, and if not the first place, the second place. Copenhagen, would be another one to look to. If you are looking then to a new city that's urbanized quickly and is particularly interested in innovation and automation and even the use of AI, you can't really go wrong by looking at Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Plenty of challenges all around in how they've approached it, but it is a pretty phenomenal place. And if you get a chance to visit, many people visit, and it's like going to the future a little bit because it is so different and so modern. But they have work to do. They do focus on government services being digitalized. They have, the Dubai Now app, I believe, has 2,000 services on it, incomparable to any other city in the world. What else can I share with you? The other, I guess, just kind of hopping around the globe a little bit. I like what's happening in Melbourne in Australia, and Brisbane is another great city. Yeah, I mean, you can feel and see the quality of life, and if reasonably efficient transportation systems, although the traffic has got worse recently. Yeah. Sometimes a city like Brisbane, which is not on anybody's radar, are doing really cool things. I'll give you one more example because it's top of mind for me. I got the chance to talk to the head of digital strategy at the city of Limerick in the Midwest of Ireland. Actually, I was born in Ireland, so it's Irish stuff is always interesting to me. And they have a pretty aggressive strategy to be a leading European smart city. A lot of their effort is focused on economics. They've had some challenging decades. They were agricultural based a few decades ago, but now it's more pharmaceutical, life sciences, financial. But they have these incredible universities, and the people, locally go to these universities. People come from all over the place, go to these universities, and then when they graduate, they leave. And they leave the city, and right. It's like this brain drain. We see that phenomenon in a lot of places, but Limerick wants people to stay. And it's a beautiful city in a beautiful landscape in a great part of the world. So they want to create an environment where not only do folks get a great education, but there's opportunity for them to stay. In contemporary businesses, and they can do research, and they can continue their studies, or they can start a company. The environment for starting a startup is ripe. And I think the final point is, and we see this actually as a consistent thread through a lot of cities, is Chattanooga in Tennessee. Again, not a high profile city, but a nice place. Wouldn't be a place that maybe Californians would think of moving to, right? But they made a decision a few years ago, about a decade ago, I think, maybe 15 years ago, that they were going to have gigabit internet deployed, and it was going to be available to everybody in the city. And suddenly they became one of the first gigabit cities, in fact, not only in the United States, but in the world. And people moved there because of that. That makes a difference. They said, if I'm going to have a gig up to my house, back 10 years ago, even, that was a big deal. And so a lot of people stayed, and a lot of people moved there because of that infrastructure. So, having good services, good, reliable, high quality services, also plays into this notion of what it means to be smart and sustainable.
Is there a place where emerging knowledge, the emerging wavefront of knowledge about smart cities and best practices and so on, is coalesced? I mean, is there an... I don't want to talk to Siri right now. Either an association or a journal, or I mean, where do you go to kind of get the panorama?
Well, to be selfish,
Human
you come to me. Yeah. I've written the books on. I mean, my Smart Cities for Dummies is the go-to book for this topic. I mean, certainly there are organizations. So let's talk sort of city-based. I mean, you've got the International City Managers Association, ICMA. That's probably the biggest and most important of the sort of unifying city associations in the world, ICMA. So they have their smart city knowledge base. They have talent there, and they know the people. They know me. I think that's probably one of the key areas, the ICMA. Then you've got things like the League of Cities and the equivalent of the League of Cities that people can consult with. Various, I mean, the League of Cities is the US one, but there's equivalent ones in communities around the world. Now, when you get more to the private sector, there is the Smart Cities Council, and they have been quite active, and they've been around for a while, and they do have a little bit of commercial interest in what they do. So if you're looking for completely unbiased, you have to be conscious of that.
Right.
And there are going to be other avenues. There's Government Technology Magazine, or GovTech Magazine in the US, and State Scoop, who I write for. They're very good. By the way, in the back of my book, in the back of Smart Cities for Dummies, I have a number of appendices, and one of them is absolutely, and one of the section is a list of about 100 of these organizations.
Okay.
The description and the link to each.
So you probably need a meta-level organization to kind of bring order to the 100 there. Well, listen, our second guest has arrived. So I think we're going to have to switch gears, but I wanted to just conclude not only by thanking you, but also give us a two-liner on why you wrote the Smart Cities book for kids. That was what we were going to talk about. That. I mean, why kids? Why that book?
Yep. Big surprise to me, actually. I mean, it's not, it makes sense that a lot of my effort and focus would be on cities and organizations. And then a children's author called Brett Hofstad reached out to me through LinkedIn, and he said, "Hey, have you thought about writing a book for kids?" I said, "No." And then he explained what he was doing. He'd written a lot of books, and we strategized and decided, you know what? These topics, the topic of climate change, the topic of clean energy, of waste management, the topic of opportunity and economic opportunities. Kids need exposure to this. Now, sure. What we found out talking to teachers around the country is, part of most curriculum is some level of city discussion and civics discussion. Right. So we're building on that. We built on that, and teachers helped inform the book and helped us write it. And while the book has only been out about 2 or 3 weeks,
oh, really?
Kids love it. Yeah. And teachers are embracing it. We thought we'd sell it to grown-ups who were in the smart city space, like mayors and stuff. Yeah. But it turns out it's the schools and the school teachers is who we have to target. So I was motivated to do that.
That's great. Well, I look forward to taking a look at both of those, and congratulations on your great work. Great to meet you. And thanks for being here.
Thanks, John. It was such a pleasure. I'm so glad I had the time with you. Thank you.
Great. Me too. Okay. Well, take care. Okay, Gregarious, I think you're still backstage doing your magic, but here is Rob Atkinson, untouched by my human hands. Welcome, Rob. We were just vamping a little bit, waiting for your august arrival, and I'm so glad you're here. Rob Atkinson is the CEO of the IT Innovation Foundation in Washington, D.C., and one of the leading voices for a rational approach to national innovation, to manufacturing policy, to dealing with our peer competitors in the 21st century global economy, and many other topics. He's also a colleague and a friend who I've had the pleasure of sharing a number of some exotic, some not so exotic experiences, gallivanting across China in a non-air conditioned train to ferret out innovation leaders in China and try to cobble together a G2 innovation strategy, which I think is still a bit of a promissory note, perhaps even more so in the current environment. So there are so many things we could talk about, Rob, and so many topics, so little time. But first of all, welcome. It's great to see you, and thanks for being here.
Great to see you, John.
Yeah. So let's see. Maybe I'll take my headphones off so I can hear you better. So one thing that I really wanted to get your perspective on was this The current status of the pending legislation around innovation policy in the U.S. We're talking about what started off as the Endless Frontier Act. Apparently, it's morphed. It's made its way through the Senate and is now being debated in the House and has been atomized into a number of sub-agendas that are now being debated. I find the whole process confusing, and if I find it confusing, I'll bet that the woman and man in the streets probably finds it almost impossible to follow. What's our user's guide to the reality of what's going on now in terms of this apparently noble effort to get us more engaged with the national innovation agenda and competitiveness? What should we be paying attention to, and what's really going on? Because the whole situation seems kind of murky, and you're the ideal person to kind of give us some clarity about where we are.
Yeah, so I think the user's guide is Alice in Wonderland. It's very, very convoluted. So, backstory is essentially Senator Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, Democrat from New York. He, for whatever reason, decided a couple of years ago that the U.S. was losing its technology-based competitiveness, or we were going fast enough, that's the way to put it, and that we needed a really serious shift in policy. So what he proposed, and he enlisted Senator Todd Young, or really a great Republican from Indiana, to be co-sponsors of a bill called the Endless Frontier Act. And that bill was going to do several things. One is it was going to create a new directorate within the National Science Foundation, but for technology, more for applied research. NSF, as I'm sure your listeners know, pretty much basic research for science. This would have created a category of 10 core technologies that the U.S. needed, things like quantum computing and AI and others, and give NSF a bunch of money to the new director. It also did other things like an ITIF proposal that we came out with to create maybe 10 more innovation hubs in the country. So not just Silicon Valley or Boston, but maybe a place like Columbus or Pittsburgh. Anyway, that all sort of came together. And then at the same time in the Senate, there was several other bills, efforts, a bunch of them related to China. They merged all that legislation together. And another bill that I think you know about was the CHIPS Act, which is a $50 billion allocation to make sure we have incentives for chip companies to build back fabs here and do R&D and the like. It all got put together into a big package called the bill, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. That passed the Senate. I believe it was 64 votes. So you had a bunch of Republicans who signed on. It would cross the 60-vote threshold you need to be able to do things like that. And then, you have to have the House has to have a similar bill. Now, this is where things get tricky because the House Science Committee doesn't really like the idea as much of an NSF for technology. They're more traditionalists. And on top of that, you have a lot of forces in the House that really don't want to invest money. This is investment we're talking about. This is putting money into things that ultimately are going to help business. Bernie Sanders was quoted why he supported the bill in the Senate was he didn't want any money going to business. So the House is much more ambiguous about where they're going to be. And then ultimately what's going to have to happen is, although to be fair, Speaker Pelosi has said that she's committed to this and wants to come up with a bill. So the latest version or iteration is maybe after January, they'll come together, they'll essentially agree on a bill. Now, what's making this more complicated, I'll just wrap up with this, is the $3.5 trillion package, basically social spending package. Some of it's infrastructure, but most of it's social spending that the Democrats are super committed to, and particularly the House. So that is taking a little bit of the air out of the balloon or wind out of the sails of making these big investments to compete with technology. And so there's, we're now going to have, free childcare and free college and, subsidies for home health care workers. Not that any of that is bad, but at the end of the day, there's only a limited amount of money. And Congress has to make a pretty serious choice. Do they want to invest in the future, or do they want to subsidize the president? So that's my worry, that we're going to lose some of the oomph on this as things go on in the fall.
So a couple of questions to follow up. One is it still a piece of innovation legislation that relates to a national innovation strategy? And where does the manufacturing agenda fit into this? Because there is also a parallel effort to fund advanced manufacturing and to kind of put our manufacturing, foundation, such as it is, back on its feet, or at least kind of from the ankles up, or something like that. So there are some moving pieces within which innovation is embedded, and I would imagine even in the $3.5 trillion social support so-called infrastructure bill, that there would be some opportunities for quote unquote innovation. But I'm deferring to you, because you've read these bills and I haven't.
Well, you would think that, but you would be sort of wrong.
Yeah.
To be fair, in that 3.5 trillion, there is some things in there for clean energy innovation.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's unfortunate what's happened in Washington, because the last big thing we did in this space was 1989, the thing called the Omnibus Trade and Competitiveness Act, and that created a whole set of new programs, both trade programs, and it created NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, renamed it, gave it all these new initiatives on innovation, did a whole bunch of great things. It was because both parties were more in the center. What's happened now is the parties are much more divergent. And so you have a lot of Democrats on the progressive wing who think the only technology policy is energy. All the rest of it is meaning, or perhaps a technology policy related to minority opportunity. But sort of the kind of core technology policy around just driving innovation, competing, advanced manufacturing, they don't care that much about it, frankly. Now, a lot of Democrats do, but a lot of Democrats that don't. Second point, you mentioned, John, a strategy, and you and I have both long argued, and you in particular, about why it's important to develop a strategy, how one goes about developing a strategy for your whole group of other countries where they were this innovation leads. And there's not really that effort in these bills. It's more of programmatic initiatives rather than thinking overarching strategy, or even the capabilities one would need to develop a strategy. So that's point one. On the manufacturing part, the USICA bill actually has some very good manufacturing provisions in there, a number of ones that ITIF has long championed. For example, the expansion of a program called Manufacturing USA, which are right now 15 of these centers that industry leads, things like process biotechnology manufacturing and 3D printing. So there's money in there to expand those. There's money in the NSF part to focus on manufacturing-oriented R&D centers. There's expanding of the NIST manufacturing partnership program with small companies. So that bill's, it doesn't have as much money as we would have liked, but it has some good initiatives in there. Unfortunately, the $3.5 trillion package, although it's a little unclear yet, it doesn't really look like it has a serious manufacturing component. But there is one new initiative that we're big fans of, and that's Senator Chris Coons, who's a Democrat from Delaware. And I'm sorry I'm not going to get the name of the bill right, but I can share it with you later. He has a really interesting bill that he's the lead on to create essentially a manufacturing investment bank. So this would be sort of like Exim Bank for exporters. This would be for domestic investment in manufacturing and helping companies with long-term patient capital. Really, really important idea. And he just introduced that bill, I believe, maybe 6 weeks ago. So we'll see where that goes.
That's interesting. I mean, I wonder if that's a model for financing other streams of activity. I mean, like a innovation investment bank, or upskilling and retraining investment bank.
There's a lot of opportunity there. What was interesting is when the Senate was controlled by the Republicans, Senator Marco Rubio, a Republican from Florida, he was the chairman of the Small Business Committee, and we worked quite closely with his team. But they came up with this really great reform set of reform ideas for the Small Business Administration. to drive a lot of their capital and their lending more into innovation. You
Right.
know, if you look at the SBA programs, and they fund liquor stores, they have
Yeah.
loans for
Right.
liquor stores. They actually have loans for banks,
Hmm.
car dealers. I mean, who cares? I mean, not that those companies aren't useful. We all value going to pick up a good bottle of wine. They
Yeah.
don't need financing. And so he was trying to really drive SBA into being more of an innovation supporter for high growth startups. Unfortunately, politics intervened, and Democrats didn't like it, and it ended up running out of time before they finished the Senate, and now it's controlled by the Democrats, who don't have exactly that same perspective. But there certainly is talk about that idea, John, and it
Yeah.
is back now.
Well, it speaks to a basic misunderstanding about the difference between small business and entrepreneurial business. I mean, it's not a sharp distinction, but it's definitely a distinction, and it speaks to then the larger dilemma of not having a strategy, which is really a clear articulation of what you're going to do, what you're not going to do, and why. I mean, it's really no more complicated than that. And you would expect that there'd be some, smart younger, you know, technocrats in the executive branch of government or somewhere who would have the wherewithal. I mean, I'm sure if you and I got together for a week, we could knock something out. That would be a clear articulation of what the parameters are around which a national innovation agenda needs to be spun up, and why it matters, and to eliminate a lot of the kind of almost theological confusion around what these things really are. But I guess that isn't forthcoming, or maybe there are 10 different versions of it, so there's more
No,
confusion.
I wish there were 10 different versions. It's funny because in the book that I wrote with my colleague Mike Lynn a couple of years ago for MIT Press, called Big is Beautiful: Debunking the Myth of Small Business, what we proposed at the end was remissioning SBA and turning it into the NBA, the New Business Association.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we need to be focusing on helping new businesses,
Right.
particularly new growth business. But to your point about strategy, look, I think the reason there's not a strategy is when you're in a Republican administration, their DNA is still very, very much free market. Strategy is sort of the Russian Goss plan kind of thing, and
Mm-hmm.
just let the market do it. But now, when you're in a Democratic administration, the Democratic Party has become, at its core, a redistributionist party.
Mm.
Republicans are much more about tax cuts, particularly for the wealthy, freedom. Democrats are really about redistribution. So to your point,
Right.
You and I could sit down for a week, and we could hammer out a strategy. It's not hard to do. The reason why we're not doing it is because, frankly, there just isn't the political will to do it. I had a recent piece where I said there's really three different camps in Washington. There's the freedom camp. Hey, I want my freedom from the Republicans. There's the fairness camp from the Democrat, or a lot of Democrats, more left-wing Democrats. And then there's, I said, this third camp, the flourishing camp.
Is the what camp? Sorry?
Flourishing.
Flourishing.
I had to find another F.
Yeah, that's good. That's a Martin Seligman term, right? A
Yeah,
growth mindset term.
Yeah. And so the idea is, how do we flourish? Well, we flourish through innovation.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, that camp is much smaller. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
really have a home. And so you get certain members, like Congress, as I mentioned, the 4 senators I talked about, they're into flourishing. They want to do something about it. But so far, we don't have a big flourishing camp. And the other component of that, I have to say, is I don't think the private sector's done enough.
Mm-hmm.
If industry were really pushing this, we could do more. But the problem is what industry does is they push very narrow things that are right in front of their bottom line, and developing an innovation strategy is not at the top.
Not a high priority. Do you think there's something on the horizon that would create a visceral sense of urgency that might change that equation? I mean, much has been said about how the the current discussion about USICA is based partly on some paranoia about China. There hasn't been a boot dropping off the side of the bed loudly. It's more like the frog in the boiling water right now. But if and when, or when China lands someone on the moon, or if there's some problem somewhere, or I'm just wondering what you see as being possible ways in which either by design or by accident, there's going to be a sense of urgency to change things. Because, we in America, we love a good come from behind story. I mean, that, we're sitting around with the world's 25th largest military, and then Pearl Harbor hits, and all of a sudden we become this, military behemoth. And, we have all the capacity to pull all these ingredients together and do much more amazing things than we are. Our level of ambition seems quite low right now, in
Yeah,
my humble opinion.
our level of ambition is just don't screw up. That's kind of the best we can hope.
Right.
Yes. Look, I used to think this, John. I used to think, well, we need a Sputnik moment, but when the Chinese put the satellite around the moon, that wasn't it. When they developed the fastest supercomputer in the world, that wasn't it. I don't think that's going to be enough. I think something like, for example, one or two major U.S. companies going out of business. That I won't name who they are, but you and I could both think of three or
Sure.
four that are weakened, that 10 years ago were seen as globally very strong, if not dominant. And that would be a wake-up call. People would finally, because right now, one of the problems we have is we've lost a lot of capabilities in a bunch of technology sectors. But we still have Google, we still have Apple, we still have Facebook, we still have Amazon. Cool, fantastic companies spending a lot on R&D. And that sort of hides the weakness or the rot behind them.
Yeah.
And look, to be fair, we're investing enormous in venture capital. We got great entrepreneurs. We got great startups. Don't get me wrong. To your point, there's a lot we could build on. So I think that's one thing. I think the other possibility would be probably more likely. I hate to say this, really look at what the UK did. It took the UK really.
The UK, what? Sorry, you got a little
it,
faint.
it took the United Kingdom to really develop significant economic disruption before you finally had a consensus from both the conservative and liberal parties that they need to reinvigorate. And so under Boris Johnson, you have a whole set of, they're trying to create a DARPA. In fact, they may have already done it. I can't remember. Defense Advanced Research Project Agency for the UK. They're panicked and they know they've got to do something. And so they're trying to do something. I really, really hope for the sake of my kids that we don't wait that long. Because, it's like a turnaround in a company. If you let a company go down so far and then you bring a turnaround expert in, it's a lot harder to do it than if you did it, a few years before that.
Right. Well, so back to this lumbering herd of legislative initiatives or loping portfolio. What should we expect to see over the next 6 to 12 months? I mean, you said that our next milestone might be January when people kind of have a coherent discussion about this. I mean, when is something going to happen?
Yeah, and so it's interesting because one of the things that if you're not in Washington, people they criticize Congress for taking a long time and things like that. And there's some legitimacy to that, but on the other hand, look, these are really important issues, and the way Washington works to its credit is there's lots of opportunities to say, wait a minute, what about this, or oh, we better look at that, and so. It's okay that at some level they're taking their little bit of time because getting this right is important. And just because somebody drafted a piece of language in a bill doesn't mean they got it right. So you need enough time to go through all that. So I think we'll know two things. One, it looks like the House will pass what's called a reconciliation package, which is basically just a huge spending package of $3.5 trillion. The Senate passed a budget approval that said they could do that, but it's not at all clear to me that some of the more moderate Democrats in the Senate would go along with that. But that's one signal, and that's going to happen in the fall, or it's not going to happen. And then the idea, at least from the people I've talked to on the Hill, is once that big pig in the python is through the system, they then immediately turn to USICA. And that's I would imagine. I think when does Congress come back? Second week of January, third. It's maybe see something by the end of February, not sooner. If you asked me 3 years ago, hey Rob, what would you think if we increased federal R&D and manufacturing programs by $50 billion over 10 years? I'd be thrilled. problem is that the initial you seek out of the bill and all that were more like 200 billion.
Right.
So if that's your bar, then I'm disappointed. If the bar was what it was 2 years
Right.
ago, I'm pretty okay.
So managing expectations is part of the game.
Exactly.
Yeah. Are there going to be public hearings that are happening between now and when votes occur?
I don't believe there will be, because, well, certainly not in the Senate, because that bill has been, they've had a
Yeah,
whole set of
they've done
hearings
it.
on various things and pieces of it, and it got packaged and voted passed. There may be some hearings in the House, particularly the House Science Committee,
Mhm.
on various components of it. So it's
Yeah.
important to be looking at those. But we're close to the finish line here. I'm close
Yeah.
to getting this thing done and putting it in a package. And now the other thing we also have to remember is in Washington, there's a difference between authorization and appropriation.
Mm.
You can pass a bill that says 50 billion, but meaningless unless the appropriators
Right.
give you the 50.
Right.
It looks like there's some commitment by the appropriators this time around, but we'll see.
Yeah. Got it. So we have another minute or so. I'm just curious to know what's hot at ITIF these days. What are you guys working on that's top of mind that you can tell us about?
Well, a few things. One is we've launched a whole new initiative on tech innovation for hard to decarbonize sectors. Big mouthful, but a lot of people are always talking about auto, driving your car and your solar panel. Those aren't easy, but they're not hard. We know how to do it. How do you decarbonize the steel sector or the cement industry? Those are hard, and we're going to have to figure out a way to do it if we're going to meet our climate goals. So that's a big initiative that we're focused on. We're also focused on how do we make sure that antitrust policy is not at odds with innovation. So we just launched a program called the Schumpeter Project, Joseph Schumpeter, the patron saint of innovation.
Sure.
To help policymakers understand that antitrust needs to be enabling innovation, not at odds with innovation. So that's another big area.
Yeah, we're not European regulators. We're Americans.
I hope so. No, I'm serious because I really worry that there's so much pressure in Washington. There's so much, look, there's no question we need a national privacy bill. We do, but we don't need the European GDPR privacy bill.
Right.
There's no question we need some AI frameworks. Sure, but we don't need the European precautionary principle AI framework.
Right. Or the Beijing algorithm list that just came out.
Yes, or the no more. Well, I don't know. Maybe it'd be good to not have to prevent my kid from doing video gaming more than 1 hour a day. But
yeah, but it should be their choice whether they want to,
It should be the family's choice.
Yeah,
We're just joking around here, but yeah, absolutely. We don't want the Beijing approach. We don't want the European approach. Both are. One is failed, and one is simply just not who we are, and it's not appropriate. Yeah. Can we do that? I don't know. That's one of the big questions we'll see over the next 2 years.
Well, I think everyone can get a sense of why Rob is such a strong and important voice out there to bring perspective to things. I encourage everyone to check out ITIF's website, itif.org, if I remember correctly. And Rob, it's always great to talk with you. I mean, I feel more educated just in the last 25 minutes, so I really appreciate it.
John, same here. Really, it's always great to touch base with you. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Well, to be continued. Take care, Rob. Okay. Bye. So there we are. Hard to believe that another week has gone by. Next week, I'm confident that we'll have Brian. So we'll be in stereoscopic domain expertise land again for a couple of equally interesting and intriguing guests. So until next week, thank you for tuning in. Thank you to our two amazingly interesting guests. You never quite know how the stories are going to fit together, but I think you got a sense of real dimensionality in terms of what they had to share and also how they link together. So have a great week. See you next time. Gregarious, maybe you can rock us out, or I'll just randomly punch buttons here until something interesting happens. So I think Gregarious is, if I were sitting at my piano, I would play the exit music, but I think you can kind of fill in with your imagination. So until next week, here's Intersections Live signing out.